So making sure when we're raising enough money to be able to circumvent the list that we're getting, knowing that, okay, what are potential issues the debt company's going to see that we're going to have to fix up. Sean, can you give us a little bit of an overview of when we're raising, not only for, to take down the deal, but also for that CapEx? How do we know how much to raise? And then how do we fold that into, as soon as we close the deal and we've raised that money, now we're getting it deployed?
So I was at a speaking engagement the night before last, and one of the questions was, hey, getting started, how do we know what the CapEx budget's going to be? And therefore, hence your question, how much more do we need to raise? One of the things that we've talked about before is to ensure that when you guys are putting together a team, that you make sure that you have somebody with construction knowledge, number one. And, look, it's not a mandatory thing, but it certainly has been advantageous for us in our group because we have that experience. We're able to not have to rely on a general contractor to go out there. And you may or may not know the GC. And if you do, great. It's just another avenue of being able to kind of quickly assess. And you can do that, even on a tour, you guys can do that, right? You don't need to say, hey, this is my general contractor with me, but more of a, hey, this is my partner. You definitely want somebody with you to get an initial assessment. We have rules of thumb like $10,000 a door, $15,000 a door, depending on where the asset is. And then you kind of start fine tuning, we're into LOI or into PSA or into due diligence. And then we're starting to call out actual contractors, vendors, subcontractors, et cetera, et cetera. Back to the speaking engagement that I was at, I brought up that not a whole lot of people talk about is that when you do get your CapEx budget established, you need to understand who controls that. In order to understand who controls that, you need to make sure you have, the lender's going to either want to escrow the money or they're going to want to say, hey, you got some milestones to take care of in such and such date. In hindsight, if the lender escrows the money, there's a lot of things that we need to be prepared for. And the first and foremost is capital. There's a lot going on just to understand, to your question, Janet, to understand how that gets deployed. You may not have it to deploy, is kind of what I'm getting at. That may be escrowed from the lender, which is fine. Just need to know that going into that, and you'll establish that as you get your debt vehicle lined up, whether or not they want to escrow the money. So it can work both ways, but just be sure that you know which way it's going to go so that you can have your group prepared. Certainly need to know what you're walking into, before you close the property so that you can be prepared on how to deploy that capital.
What else do you, Sergio, look for whenever we're assessing a deal and we're saying, okay, we need to anticipate some of this CapEx, not only being updates, upgrades, but some of that lender list too, so we can get a pretty clear picture of what that amount is going to be. What are you looking for, Sergio, when you're walking property?
Great question. I actually, I look at the big ticket items that could possibly be costly. The last thing that anybody needs is a surprise. So me being a concrete guy, the importance of how foundations work because I build them myself. I'm looking at foundations. I'm looking at structure. I'm looking at possible issues with foundations, which could lead to plumbing issues, which could lead to just domino effects, right? That's one of the first things I personally like to look at because we might sit here and be like, you know what? We see that we can fix those cracks. We can put some lipstick right on, give it a facelift, but the buyer or any engineer comes out and takes a look at that and says, hey, you cannot get your certificate of occupancy because you need to fix all these foundations because it's a hazard. And all of a sudden you got a $200,000 or $100,000 bill that you weren't expecting or that you have to go raise. Depending on what kind of debt you secure, you need all your CapEx money raised in order to close. You're supposed to close in a month. You got to go raise another 200. You see what I'm saying? You know where all this is coming. First, the domino effect. Another thing is roofs. Let's get on those roofs. So let's look at the conditions because once again, these brokers are going to say, yeah, roofs, because that's one of the things on the questionnaire. Mr. Broker, when were the roofs last replaced? So roofs, foundations, Number one, one of the top two things I personally look for. I'm also looking at the chiller systems, boiler systems. You want to analyze, you want to bring an expert out there. Because as we all know, those things can be very, very costly. That's 50 grand, 60 grand that, maybe you're not accounting for, because guess what? The broker said that the boiler system was replaced 5 years ago, and that those things last for 30 years, right? 20 years. You're like, oh, we're good. But then boom, all of a sudden you get that hit because we didn't do our due diligence, and you got to go buy a new one, and you didn't account for that, right? Those are some of the top three things that I look for. And guys, that's going to be really something that we got to consider as we're walking to get done.
That's good. Well, you're bringing up some really good things.